This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. Recorded live on Wednesday afternoons in a Google Hangout. Visit us at talkingdrupal.com. This
Did we lose you?
Hey guys.
Hey.
How you doing?
I had a little bit of a freeze up there. I wasn't really quite sure where we were.
Oh, no,
Hi.
we're here. We're here and ready to roll. Welcome to episode 60.
Like a professional, Steve just carried right on.
Yeah, let's just keep rolling.
Good work.
So, welcome Jason Palmental from HW Design.
Hello, Steve. Hello, everyone.
Good afternoon.
So we have a show planned here to talk about multi-language websites. We did start recording a little bit late today, and we're going to stay right on agenda so we can finish on time. So that's our goal today, is not too many rat holes. We all agree?
Wrong
Yes.
topic for that, most likely. But
Right, exactly. So joining us is the biggest rat in the hole,
Oh,
John Pacozzi from Oomph. And I only say that with love and care and how you love to bring up other topics. So
I do love to bring up other topics, but not as bad as some other topics.
I think we're going to start off the show with one, by the way. So we'll get to that in a moment, though.
Good
Also,
possibility.
we have Nick Laughlin from Enlightened Design.
How you doing?
Good.
short and to the point. Thanks, Nick.
Nick is following the mantra for the day. Quick answers. So before we get into our topic, there was some news this week about Amazon investing in Aquia. And I can't wait to hear all the wisdom that everyone has to share about that investment. I think it was, what, $50 million? Was that what
It was actually undisclosed.
Yeah.
Aquia announced a round of funding for $50 million.
But that was 3 months ago.
But Amazon didn't disclose how much they gave Aquia. Everybody is assuming that it's more than 50 million, maybe. I think is the word on the street.
I haven't been on that street.
Yeah.
I mean, the article was on VentureBeat was a little vague, but I mean, I think the takeaway for me was just that it's, I think, validation of interest in Drupal in the enterprise, and I think that's a good thing.
Definitely, I definitely agree with that, Jason. I think Amazon putting a large amount of money into a company that has based their business on Drupal and Drupal services is a huge home run for Drupal and business. So I'm excited about that. I'm also excited to see what that relationship produces, because I can only imagine with those two companies and those two CEOs that something great will come out of it.
Yeah, well, that's there's two, like there's Google App Engine, and then there's Amazon's EC2, and like their AWS file structure, and there are two different ways that you can get Drupal running on those cloud services. You can't get it. It's really difficult to get running on the App Engine interface platform with Google. Amazon, I think, is a better fit. So it's kind of nice to see that that kind of come together better, to be able to have companies look at that and rely on it for their hosting instances of Drupal.
I also think, just from a product awareness and validation perspective, having a press release that has Amazon and Drupal in the same sentence with the word investing in it is just great. That's good to see. I don't know enough about. I'm not sure anyone knows enough about the deal or what this really means in general, but it certainly is not going to hurt, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was a bit. We don't usually have any news on the show, but that was something that sort of stuck out in everyone's head this week. And this news is, I think, a couple of weeks old actually, and I think it took a little while to surface.
Well, it was a week ago that this was posted.
Just a week ago. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean this article, but I'm talking about the actual. Seems to me I had been reading about this for a couple of weeks, but maybe not. Maybe
I
it's
think
not
there
been
were
a week.
I don't
I
know.
think there were two separate things. I think Aquia had another round of funding in general, and then I think Amazon came in on top of that last week. So I think their last funding round was a month or so ago, and then Amazon came in. I don't think it was part of the general round of funding.
Mm.
I believe Nick is correct. I concur.
Well, there we
Good,
go.
since I think you're my source.
Great.
Oh man.
All right. So let's move on to talking about multi-language websites, and I'd like to start this by just getting sort of a feel for how much work have people done in this space. You guys consider it a core competency of what you guys deliver, or something that you've done a few times? Just I want to set the stage in terms of the kinds of things we can share today. Are we sharing expert level knowledge, or are we sharing?
When do we ever do that, Steve?
Yeah, I know. Maybe I'm speaking for myself.
Well, I mean, I can say I've done enough to know that it's more complicated than it seems. It's one of those things where you think it's really just, hey, you install a module, you translate the content, and you're done. And I've done that for one site. My business site is multilingual. It's Spanish and English, and that's thanks to my wife. She, when we were dating, decided that I needed to have a Spanish website, so she translated everything. So of course I had to figure out how to have a dual language website, and very quickly realize how even having a site that only has 10 pages or so and 4 or 5 menu items, how complicated it can get. And I know I just scratched the surface. It's a whole different ballgame translating something from English to Spanish versus something that is character-based like Japanese, or right to left like Hebrew or Arabic, or uses non-English or non-Roman Roman characters, and uses like
Yeah.
Cyrillic characters
Right.
like Russian or something. It's something that on the surface clients many times thinks is very easy, especially if they already have translated content.
Well, yeah. When they think that they can drop in the Google Translate drop down and it works, they have no idea how many implications that has. I mean, I haven't done a ton of it, but we did build multiple language support into the Schoolyard platform. We never had any sites that took us up on fully translating things, but we had one site that had some stuff in Arabic. We had a site that had some stuff in Japanese, and I think what has always kind of impressed me is just sort of the general way Drupal goes about making it work. So I wouldn't say we'd necessarily have like super expert knowledge, but I think a fairly good grasp of how to get it going, and what the basics are and some of the main pitfalls.
Yeah, I think I'm probably in the same boat. A lot of clients are very interested in multilingual, and I've done 1 or 2 multilingual sites in the past, and I think both of those actually were in Drupal 6. So I don't know that I've ever completed a Drupal 7 multilingual site. I hear it got a lot easier in 7, or better, I guess I should say. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say, and also contributing my knowledge as it stands.
And it's also important to note there's a big difference between translating a site and having a multilingual site and localizing a site. Because
Yeah, that's true.
You can very easily translate a site into Spanish, but there's different, I suppose, dialects of Spanish, whether you're in Spain or Mexico, Puerto Rico, Colombia, Argentina, or any of the other, Spanish-speaking countries. And then, how far do you want to take it? Are you translating just some key pieces of content? Are you translating the admin interface? Are you translating menus? Are you translating emails that go out from the website?
Well, I think we should talk about some of those different things that Drupal supports. I mean, in its core, localizing a site, meaning just saying we have one website and we just need it to be in a language that's not English. That's a very much like a core thing in Drupal for you to be able to install a language pack, essentially, which brings with it a translation dictionary and some number of terms, and they all have kind of varying degrees of completeness. And what that does by enabling it and setting a language as the default language for the site, it takes care of character encodings and stuff in the meta tags for the pages so that they'll render correctly in browsers, and it gives you a dictionary of static terms that are used throughout the system, and you can think of like menu items, taxonomies, button labels, all of these sort of static little words and phrases that get used throughout Drupal in the admin interface and also in little bits that show up on the screen that are not your core content, that you have this dictionary and you can just go through and see, okay, there's this many terms that have been translated, and I need to translate these other terms to make sure that I can have my whole, either the public side or the public side and the admin interface in this other language. But that's really just supporting one language on the website. It just happens to not be English. So Nick's example of doing a Spanish website that way, that's actually fairly straightforward. There's not too much more that you would have to do. It's when you want to be able to have more than one language and one as a default that it adds a lot of complexity. But I think Drupal handles it in a really interesting and pretty elegant way.
I think there's a use case that is even simpler that we should just mention, which doesn't really require anything. And that we've had a number of customers that have said, I want these 3 pages in Spanish.
Right.
A U.S. customer, I want these 3 pages in Spanish, and there just need to be a link on that page that says view it in Spanish. You virtually don't need to do anything for that. I mean, you could...
Well, you have to have the language pack installed, so that way the language encoding for the page gets done correctly. I mean, if it's a Western language and Western character set, then it actually doesn't change, but it should at least have like that little 2-letter code indicating the language in the meta tags of the page, so that it gets rendered correctly in the browser. But yeah, that's like we've done that with Arabic and some Japanese pages on some of the schoolyard sites.
And the other thing to note too is a lot of this stuff that you're talking about, Jason, is fairly well covered in core.
Right. Yeah. I don't think that requires any non-core modules to enable that level of functionality.
Except a lot of contrib modules, if they don't pass things through the translate function properly, things still won't translate. So I mean, even if you're just doing one language and trying to make everything localized, you'll still occasionally have some work to do with contributed modules.
Yeah, that's true.
So
I think if you're using very common modules, then that's generally not a problem. It's if you're using some I don't want to say strange modules, but modules that might be for small things that maybe don't have a lot of usage.
Yeah.
Then you can run into little things like that.
I mean, I think that's one of... So Nick mentioned the translate function, and that's actually something that's built into like that sort of the core methodology of how you output stuff from a module. Every chunk of text that your module is putting out on the screen is supposed to be wrapped in a T function, meaning that string has parentheses around it with a T in front of it, and that tells Drupal that that's an entry that should go in that dictionary that I mentioned earlier. So if you do that all the time, very consistently, then if you enable that language pack to translate your site, that would come up as a string of text that needs to be translated. And I think Drupal's international user base really comes in as a strength here, because tons of module developers do not speak English as their first language. So when they're developing these modules, that stuff is primary on their mind, so that their modules will show up correctly. Because the sort of the default language for Drupal.org is English, So basically, if you want your module to work, if you are a native Spanish speaker and you're developing a Drupal module, the likelihood is you're going to be using that T function in order to get your own stuff to show up in your own language, because when it's going in Drupal.org, the default is to have it be displaying in English.
Yeah, it's not often that I think there's one module I've actually opened and the README was in German or something. But typically the docs are in English and the actual modules are written in English as well. But it was a bit of a shock for me once when I was trying to figure out why a module wasn't working. I opened the README and saw some German.
Something.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say something else to think about too when you're doing multilingual. You guys talked about translation in core, and then there contributed modules. Third-party JavaScripts as well. If you're using, say you're not using a module, you're using some sort of third-party service that just gives you a JavaScript snippet to drop on your page. You want to think about that when considering multilingual, because that you can those will definitely not translate unless the service actually supports that. And maybe you have to give that code a variable to switch languages or switch the code to a different language altogether. So that's something to definitely think about as well.
Well, so we should describe how Drupal handles like a fully multilingual website, because I think that's really interesting in the way that it works. So in addition to that translation dictionary that has, let's say you want to have your website in English, Spanish, and German, you install the Spanish and German language packs, and I'll add that, like something Nick brought up before we even started. There might be variations of language packs. A Spanish language that is geared, that's sort of Mexico or Spain. I know that there's sort of variants of English, so you can get a US, like the default US English, or you could install a UK English language pack. And so you have those two language packs installed, so you want to have your website in 3 languages. You set English as your default, and then you add modules like internationalization or I18N and some other ones, and essentially what Drupal does then is it will allow you to create a version of every node in each language. And if you allow a user to set their own preference that they would like to browse this site in German, then it will always look for the German version of a given node, but it's presenting them with the full architecture of your website. And it will then simply give them the fallback default language page if the German language one doesn't exist. So you could, in that case, set it up in this manner, translate those 3 pages that you want to translate, and then they stay tied to that original node, which I think is really important, so that you keep the same architecture of the website, but if they're browsing it with German selected and there's a German language version of that page available, that's what they'll see. But it falls back smoothly to the default language if it's missing.
Exactly. And I think this is probably the time to start talking about it. There's 3 or 4 main things that you're looking at when you're trying to build those multilingual sites, at least in Drupal's case. One is the actual content or entities, whether it might be products, it might be nodes. The menu system, which is kind of, people are used to seeing the menu in the menu system and on the node page, but they're actually separate non-entity entities in Drupal. So you kind of have to have a system in place for translating those and switching them out depending on what language the person's on. And then a third thing is how you're handling the switching, and that could be as simple as a subdomain or a path. So a lot of sites, I typically prefer having like /en/whatever or /de/whatever. But you can also do subdomains, and I think there's a way to do it with cookies, although when I tested that, it was really wasn't very well supported. And then kind of the third thing that you need to consider, again, I think this is mainly Drupal specific, is those kind of leftover things. and there's a module that really helps with that called string overrides. But I found that web form has a special module for translating web form labels and that kind of information, but items like Mollum, no matter where I looked, there was no way to translate specific error messages in Mollum. So I was able to use string override to say, hey, look for this string if it matches. Instead, display this if you're on Spanish, for example. So again, just to recap, the things you need to look at
and the
are...
important thing, wait, just before we move on from there, and the only way that would work is if the T function is being used.
Yeah, so I believe I actually had to patch Mollum and wrap a couple things around the T function. But so the kind of 4 areas that you have to focus on that I found are menus, the actual entities, which is what most people think about, how you're going to switch languages, and then all the leftover kind of crumbs, I guess, of untranslated content.
One, depending on how you're structuring your site, you also have to think about translating taxonomy terms. If you have to address layout issues, then making sure that blocks are translated. So that's another area where you may have blocks of static content and you need to change those out. So you might have to write contexts to do that. Left to right is another one. If you're doing stuff in Arabic, you can set it to do some stuff by default, but it's probably better to be more intentional about it and just say, like, in this language, then I want to use these contexts for my main block placement, and put your navigation on the other side and stuff like that.
There's HTML tags that help with that as well. I'm wondering how that's addressed. We have a couple of sites in Arabic, and I know we can put the right to left tags
right
inside.
to left, yeah, all that does is render strings of text. Like any HTML elements it doesn't affect the source order of the page. It's not going to change flow.
No, it affects the layout. It fixes the layouts of the page and where, like, periods end up at the end of a sentence.
Well, it only affects layout in that it is, like, if you have a 3-column page and you have your nav on the left, content in the middle, and other blocks on the right, and you switch it to Arabic encoding, it's not going to flip those sidebars. Those sidebars.
No, right. I'm talking about the HTML tags, right?
So
yeah.
I actually have a question because I've never dealt with right to left. If you're in a right to left scheme, does the input change right to left as well?
Yeah. I mean, and the browser handles that. I mean, and they've been doing it that way for years and years.
It only handles it if that tag is there.
Right, but that's the point. That's why you use the language pack, because by installing the language pack, then Drupal will handle outputting the correct tag to make sure that the page renders right to left versus left to right.
So you kind of...
Arabic's common there. Japanese, Chinese are is Chinese? I know Japanese. Well, actually, Japanese can be either way, but it's common for Japanese pages to render right to left.
I think you very quickly glossed over something I think is very important too, and that's how much layout can change. So, for example, if you're translating into, from English to Spanish, then line lengths are going to be approximately equal. But if you're translating from English to German, line
40%.
20 to 40% larger. Yep. And if you're translating to Japanese or Chinese, simplify. You're going down to 10 or 15% of a line length.
Right.
So dealing with how things break and how things fit is a big.
Well, and
big difference.
What I find so interesting about it is, like, this is yet another one of those areas that responsive design kind of comes to the rescue if you're doing it well. Because if you have a fluid layout that's designed to change at varying widths, it will often be relatively simple to make sure that it also deals with varying lengths of strings in it. And you can also do things like actually alter your styles based on, like, you could you could basically call different styles based on what language the page is encoded in. So you could do some different things about layout. Because I think one of those things in particular is navigation, where if you switch out to German labels in the navigation and they're 40% longer, you have to be really careful about how things are going to wrap. Or you might think about a different way of rendering your navigation altogether.
If you've never done a site in German or a language that's either larger or smaller, it's really important very upfront to take 2 or 3 content pages, rough layouts, put them to a translator in market as soon as you can in the market that it's going to be delivered in, and get those back and just have a dialogue so you know what you're dealing with early on in the process.
We had actually the very first multilingual thing that I worked on was actually back in 1999, working on some web-to-print stuff that we were building for North Sales, and they were selling sales in every country on the planet pretty much, and so making a print and web system that worked across all of those languages was a tremendous challenge, and that was exactly how we had to go about it. Was basically get exact same content in Japanese, in German, in French, in English, and kind of compare them all and make sure that the layout would actually scale and reflow properly with all those changes.
So here, this raises a question for me, and Steve kind of alluded to it, getting translations from people in market. But as a developer, an English-speaking developer, when I'm building out these pages, or when I have these pages, in the content management system, what's the methodology for testing to make sure that the translations are correct and that everything is translating appropriately to the language or dialect that people are going to be needing it to be in?
Well, I mean, that's no more complex than accessibility testing. I mean, there's...
In some ways, I think it's more so.
I think it's
to be
more
honest.
Challenging. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but I mean,
I take your point. I don't mean to totally undercut it, but it's...
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, you have to specialize people that you speak with that... I mean, there's companies that specialize in testing that kind of information, and either you spend a lot of time figuring out yourself, or you have budget for paying somebody else that specializes in it.
You can't. So just be clear about a couple of things. Unless you're a native speaker of that language, you're not going to be able to figure it out yourself.
No.
That's not really a valid option as delivering a solution to a customer. Another point is just because your wife speaks Spanish, Nick, doesn't mean that her interpretation of the translation being proper means that it works for that for the context of that business as well.
Because if she doesn't if it's your website and she doesn't know web development, but she just knows Spanish, she may be translating the content, but maybe not in the context that you were using the language.
Right.
Exactly. And the other thing, she's not a professional translator, so she doesn't know. I mean, at the time, she spoke English, but at the time she didn't speak perfect English, so there was a lot of, she asked me a lot of questions, but if somebody didn't, they could just translate something. So, it's a rigorous process. It's not something like you can just go to a native speaker and just ask them to translate stuff and come out with something usable.
Well, what I found actually in my own mind to be even harder was actually getting cultural norms. For me, and I think for a lot of us doing websites in English in the U.S., there are certain conventions that we become used to, and things like where does secondary navigation go, and where does other content go, and what colors are normal to be used in certain circumstances. All of those things are very much tied to our own worldview, and what colors are important. When we were doing a website for a school in Tokyo, with generally the audience were the parents of the students who actually generally didn't speak English. So even though they weren't the ones reading a lot of the content, they were looking at it. So we really had to be careful about the color palette, about the use of iconography. I mean, there were a bunch of things that we just had no idea about, and we really had to rely heavily on the client to help guide us in a lot of these things. So it had to be a partnership, a very close partnership in that sense to be able to navigate some of that stuff. And the same was true with Arabic.
I think
those issues have gotten much simpler in the last 10 years, though. I mean,
maybe not simpler, but more well-defined.
No, it's not even more well-defined. I think that just the advent of the number of people that are online has made people in other parts of the world more comfortable. Like 10 years ago, it was very difficult to put a website in Arabic and not have it go right to left. You can, not saying you should do this, but you can. It's much more acceptable for someone to look at a site and not necessarily have the nav on the right-hand side that they decide they expect these days. That was a big issue 8 to 10 years ago. It's not as big of an issue today.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that because the web is global and anybody anywhere can look, in most cases, can look at websites from everywhere else, then they're exposed to a lot of things that we find normal that they might otherwise not. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think getting away with it is sort of the key there versus doing it really well. And I think there are certain things that you still have to really watch out for, and I think color is actually one of the more important ones. I mean, it's a big deal in Spain to use the wrong reds and goldish yellows. You know, it's in terms of being in the Basque region or not, and so like those are some things that I had to learn about for a project in Spain once, and I had to learn a lot about that for the school in Tokyo as well. Certain colors are good luck. Same in for the website that we did in Jordan. That was, you know, like certain colors are just kind of important positive colors, and you want to make sure that you use them in the right way.
Now, there's something else that we haven't really talked about that's key to localization that a lot of people kind of overlook, and that's forms. So here, when we create a form trying to get information about somebody, we ask for a first name, last name, and maybe a phone number and an address. And each of those items can be wildly different depending on the country you're in. Some countries have a first name, middle name, and 2 last names that never change. Some countries have a first name, last name, ancestor's name, and then, you know, a family name, and that can change depending on the point that they're in or who they're speaking to. Some people have a different name based on whether it's their family or their teachers. So even things that people generally take for granted that every single person has isn't necessarily the case. And the same is true for phone numbers. You know, different countries have different schemas for the phone numbers, and especially for addresses. You know, the way postal routing is handled in different countries is wildly different. I mean, the U.S. has a pretty standard system, but other countries it's not nearly as accurate. I mean, there's certain countries where you say go to the corner of X and Y and leave it there, and once a week somebody will check it and bring it to the person. Understandably, their mail is a little less likely to make it to where it's supposed to, but it's very different, and that's part of localizing too. And sometimes it's very difficult to determine how that should be handled.
Yeah.
Because it's not just gathering the information at some point. It's also recording it and displaying it in a way that, like if you're gathering names from India, displaying that in a way that somebody from England would understand it's a name is something to think about as well. So it's not something that I've had to deal with too heavily, again, but it's definitely something that I've realized is an issue when you're trying to localize.
Yeah. So I think It's probably worth it for us to talk a little bit. I mean, I mentioned one or two of the sort of the add-in modules that people would probably want to use, but I think we should probably talk more about those. Going on the premise that you want to make a fully multilingual website and be able to translate both content and in some cases layout.
So one thing I want to mention, and you guys can, because I've only done one, I've done lots of multi-language sites, but only one in Drupal. I'm not as familiar with the modules, but there's something we didn't mention here, I don't think, is the workflow of translating. That Drupal, one of the modules, gives you the capability of sort of creating an interface for a translator that gives them a list of pieces of content that have been translated, the ones that need to be translated, and it will color code them, so you can give someone access to an admin interface with like a translation role. They can go in and see the pieces of text that need to be translated, and when they translate it, and then comes off the list. So it's like a sort of a workflow environment for them to help manage the content.
Well, there's the internationalization module, which is kind of one of the cornerstones. And we'll have a link in the show notes to a page that actually lists modules that help extend that environment. And one of the first ones on the list is just the one that you were mentioning.
What is that called? I just couldn't remember what it was.
Hang on a second. It was right at the top of this list here. Language assignment and then translation overview.
Okay.
Translation overview is the one that provides this sort of overview of everything as it stands. Then there's like translation management tool that helps, but then you have the language assignment one is kind of neat. So basically you can assign. I'm sorry, that's not the one I was thinking of. There was a workflow one where basically you could give people tasks and say like, you have these things that you need to do to get the translation going. Lingotek also actually has a nice module to tie into their service, which is kind of an interesting way to go if you need to actually provide that service as well.
So Lingotek is a service where they will actually do translation for you.
Yep.
And they built the modules. They built the modules so you can their translators can interface directly with your website.
Yeah, and they're a big supporter of the Drupal community, so I think they're a nice resource to have in your back pocket.
Is it fair to say here that there's a common misconception among people looking for multilingual that they'll just turn on a module and all of a sudden the site will offer whatever languages they select, as opposed to the actual workflow, which is you enable the modules, and then your client or yourself, depending on who's on the hook to do it, has to get the translation and input the translation into the content management system.
Sometimes that's the case, and I think that's been perpetuated by Google Translate.
Yeah.
And I mean it does amazing stuff. I mean the Google Translate app, you can put it into conversation mode, say something in English, it will repeat it back in Spanish. The next person can say something in Spanish, and it will translate that into English, which is amazing. But if you're not, especially if you're not a native Spanish speaker and you're just speaking English, you're like, wow, this is cool. It's automatically translating what I'm saying. But one of the real insights of being married to a non-native English speaker is the translations that come from automated services like that are pretty terrible.
Well, and I think that we make jokes about that when we get stuff in support documents or in like an instruction manual that you read, and it's like, oh wow, this is clearly just not making any sense. And I think we forget that that's exactly the same thing. So when we get support documents or we see like a user manual that we know is written by somebody who just does not speak English very well, and they're just basically probably doing the same thing, translating it directly into English, and you realize like the idioms aren't right and the tense isn't right or pronouns are wrong or whatever, and we forget that that's the same thing that we're inflicting on everybody else when we use Google Translate.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, it's one of the, I'd say, I guess you could say, a curse of the system. You know, people see Google Translate and think it's that easy. But I mean, I can't really knock Google Translate. It is a fantastic program.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
And
but,
you know, we've had
but
some clients that have just said we can't spend the money to do a fully multilingual site, so can we just add this? And you say yes, and with that you say you should probably ask some of your non-English speaking parents to review this, or clients or acquaintances, and be sure you really want to do that.
It's a good mid ground between like full multilingual support and no multilingual support. To Jason's point, a lot of people don't have the resources to have their whole site translated into 6 or 7 different languages.
Yeah.
And they do business in those countries, or have to support those languages, and it's a good in between step for you to say, okay, I support this language through Google Translate.
Yeah.
Fun fact about doing business and languages, and if anybody happens to be in Quebec and can fact check me on this, feel free to send me a tweet. But apparently, in order to do business in Quebec via your website, e-commerce, your website has to be have a French translation. So there are some countries that have business requirements like that. In order to do business, you have to have certain translations. So yeah. I don't know if Google Translate fits the bill for that sort of thing, but I can't imagine that it wouldn't.
So coming back to the basic setup, we know that we've got some core modules like locale and content translation that you need to enable, and then we want to add in things like the I18N module that helps extend this and the language packs so that you can have the language available, the terms translated, and then I18N to help you have multiple language versions of each node so that people can language switch and say, I would like to have this be my default, and always get the Swahili pages before it falls back to English. And I know Nick brought up string translate, which is a great one to catch some of the things that aren't translated by default. I know there's
string override.
String override, sorry. Entity translation was the one that...
I found that entity translation handled menu translation better than internationalization, I think. And it also handles switching between languages on the edit page better, I think. I also use web form localization. I found that helped with labels, as I mentioned earlier. But you can get a lot of the information, just for a lot of what you need, just by enabling internationalization. It gives you field level translations, as well as path translation and string translation, and a couple other tools. So it's I mean, it's really robust. It's something that apparently a lot of work has been done in Drupal 8 to make it even better than Drupal 7. So there's a lot of edge cases in Drupal 7 that translation just doesn't work for, and I believe Gabor Hodgsky has done hours and hours and hours of work on getting Drupal 8's translation robust and something that is professional and easy to use.
Yeah, I think some of the stuff that Steve brought up about workflow in managing the translation and knowing what's left, like that's a really big deal. Being able to easily give the client the tools to be able to see what's still remaining to be done, and they can evaluate those terms and see which ones they really care about and translate those, and then add in as much detail as they want to, in terms of translating subsequent content. And then at least it's in their hands, so when they go and put up a press release, they can put up the English language first and then put up the translated versions as they get them, or they can do it at whatever pace they want. I think the great thing about it is it doesn't leave a user out in the cold. They'll always get something.
Okay, so we've touched on, I think, most of the hot points we wanted to hit for someone considering doing a multi-language site. I think we would summarize by saying that Drupal provides a great way to do it, accomplish it, and a lot of what you'll need is in core, and you'll need to go to some of these contribute modules for some special functionality. And you shouldn't be afraid of these kinds of sites, right?
Yeah, and I think for all of the sort of belly aches that I've heard from people about how difficult it is, I think what we have to do is sort of step back and realize what we're complaining about, because it allows us to do so much. I mean, I had to build all of this functionality from scratch in a series of .NET applications for North Sales, and believe me, that's hard. I mean, we had to make our own translate function and dictionary and all of these things and design the database for like all of that soup to nuts, and man, it is not easy. So, I mean, the amount of stuff that we have at our fingertips is pretty remarkable.
Let's move on to our module of the week.
Sure.
Who posted this one this time?
That was me.
Simplify. Tell us about it.
Simplify, it's kind of ironic because I think somebody told me about it and I added it into a site I was working on, and it was a gem, and then I completely forgot what it did until a few days ago. And I started looking at it again and brought it into another one, because that's one of the things that people will throw up about Drupal is the admin experience is hard. And while they say it's hard, it's actually not that it's difficult, but that it's cluttered. And there's a lot of things that you really just want people to ignore. And we had ways of dealing with that in Drupal 6 and earlier, but simple much better. And what it does, in a nutshell, is it allows you to hide chunks of detail on the admin edit screen for any given node, for the create or the edit, and based on someone's role, just don't show it to them, but still supply the default options that have been set. So in previous ways of doing this, there was like an admin module that we used to use in Drupal 6 that would hide those things, but it turns out that it wouldn't always supply the default information. So like if you hid the author field because you didn't want them to change who was authoring the node, it would end up posting it as anonymous. But Simplify doesn't do that. So you can do it by role, you can do it by content type, and combinations of those things, so that you could, for people who are non-global level administrators, would never be able to do anything with the XML sitemap or URL aliases or changing the author of a post. If you don't want general content editors to be able to do those things, you can hide all of them. And it really does simplify the admin page. So if you want something that actually looks as simple as a WordPress content form, you can actually achieve that with the Simplify module pretty easily. So it's really quite powerful. And that's just from just for the admin users.
And it prevents the entire. Can you hide entire fields, kind of like field permissions?
You have basically it's, think of it as like hiding vertical tabs. Like, I don't want them to have access to this swath of stuff. Some of it's more granular than that, so you have to take a look at it and see all the things that it allows you. But it's a middle ground between something as granular as field level permissions, which also adds a huge amount of overhead to the processing of the page. This doesn't have any overhead to the processing of the page. It just simply is modifying what is visible when you hit edit.
Someone's ringing.
Yeah, I'm not sure who.
Me.
Oh, I'm ringing. Okay, I guess that's me. I gotta go. Well, cheers, everyone. Sorry, I hate to drop off so quickly, but I gotta go. Have a good week.
All right. Thanks, Jason. See you. All right. We're at the point of wrapping up anyway, so we'll just wrap up without him. Load himself some other day, you'd say. So, anything else to add to the show today, guys? Before we call it a day?
I'd say the only other thing is we barely scratched the surface. I mean, we touched a lot of the big topics, but this is something that can't be learned in an hour. It can't be learned in 10 hours. I mean, it's a specialization, and there's a lot of information out there, but there's also a lot of new ground being broken. Drupal makes a lot of the has a lot of tools in place to make it easier, but we didn't even touch on the process of actually getting localized translations. I mean, there's
this was like any other 1 hour show that we have. We touched the surface on things, and we're not here to train someone on implementing a multi-language site, but it is a big topic, just like security is a big topic and these other things are big topics, and in the future we can maybe drill down on one aspect of this a little bit more. Someday. So I want to remind people before we close the show that if you have any comments or any questions you'd like us to answer, you could always send us an email at talkingdrupal@gmail.com. We're also pretty active on Twitter at Talking Drupal. You can always reach out to us there. And if you're enjoying the show, some feedback on iTunes would be awesome. So feel free to go and do that. I do remind everyone also that we have a YouTube channel. If you just go to YouTube and look for Talking Drupal, you'll see all of these shows are recorded in a live hangout. So you can actually watch us as well as listen to us. I'm not sure if that's good or bad. So John Picozzi, where can people find you? You got anything special going on you want to tell us about?
Let's see. Where can people find me? People can find me on all the social networks at John Picozzi. You can find me next month speaking at the Newport Interactive Marketers Group down in Newport, Rhode Island. And you can find me always on at oomphinc.com.
Excellent. How about you, Nick?
You can find me online everywhere at Nixvan, Nicxvan, and in person out and about around Boston, Mass.
I'll keep my eyes open. You can find me at Stephen Cross with a PH or parallaxinfotech.com, and that will put a wrap to episode 60, and talk to you guys soon.
See you next week.
Take care.